The White House has recently issued a new policy regarding how the federal government will handle the process of reporting hacks and vulnerabilities in private companies. This is a big deal because, as we know, data breaches at companies do affect consumers and they affect other businesses, sometimes at very large scale. And the longer an attack or breach goes undetected, the more it costs a company and the more consumers and other companies are exposed to threats. For Tech Republic and ZDNet, my name is Dan Patterson, and it's a pleasure today to speak with Willis McDonald. He is a threat research manager at Core Security, and we're talking about what is known as the vulnerabilities equities process. So, Willis, thank you very much for your time this morning. I wonder if we could first define what this VEP, the vulnerabilities equities process, means and is, and then a little bit about what the actual practical implications of the VEP are.
So the vulnerabilities or vulnerability equities process lays out how the federal government will address vulnerabilities that they discover either through intelligence programs, through daily research by different government agencies, including the intelligence community, how these will be released, and by what standards they will assess vulnerabilities, and when they will be released, and how to actually get these vulnerabilities into the hands of the vendors that they affect.
And so when we say released or notified, we're not necessarily talking about the public, but we're talking about the government notifying company X, Y, or Z that there is a vulnerability in their system, correct?
Correct. This is just to notify the actual vendor of whatever the vulnerability is. So for instance, if it was a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows, it would notify Microsoft and allow Microsoft to go through their own process of remediating that vulnerability.
So is there a question about disclosure within the private enterprise? As we know, the at least one government department, the NSA, has hoarded cyber weapons and zero-day vulnerabilities in the past. Does this policy represent a change in how the government will operate, or will certain organizations and agencies continue to keep some vulnerabilities quiet?
Right. This is not necessarily a change in the processes that are already in place or have been in place in the past. Really, what this addresses is this brings a couple more shareholders to the table and allows other government agencies to weigh in on some vulnerabilities. However, it does not mean that these vulnerabilities will just blanket be disclosed to a vendor and then eventually remediated by that vendor. Some of these vulnerabilities allows for things like the intelligence community, for law enforcement, specifically the DOJ, to then weigh in and choose to keep some of these vulnerabilities quiet.
Yeah, so how does this relate to then not just interagency, but also intra-government or diplomatic relations? So, for example, will the U.S. also notify, say, the Chinese government or the Mexican government or the Canadian government if they find vulnerabilities that affect U.S. companies? Will this only be a domestic activity?
So this is only addressing domestic activities and U.S. government agencies. Part of the issue with this also, or one of the loopholes in this, is that if the U.S. government has an agreement or a non-disclosure type of agreement with another government, say some of our intelligence partners, then that vulnerability, if it affects their operations or falls into one of the non-disclosures, then that vulnerability is not applicable to the VEP process.
And how will this impact emerging technologies like IoT or big data / machine learning?
This really will have very little impact, other than if it so happens that the vulnerability has to do with any of those technologies, whether it's IoT, whether it's cloud data, big data. It really depends on the vulnerability, and there are a lot of exclusions for different devices and different types of vulnerabilities.
So, in your and we understand that you're not making policy or speaking on behalf of anyone other than yourself and your expertise, but is this an effective policy? Will this help keep other companies secure? Will this help companies find and properly disclose vulnerabilities? Is this an effective policy?
I really don't think this is an effective policy. There are a lot of exclusions. There are a lot of loopholes to be able to hold on to vulnerabilities. The purpose of this, or at least the stated purpose of this, is for vulnerabilities to be disclosed when they're discovered by a particular agency. But with all the loopholes, it's very easy to disregard a specific vulnerability based on how effective it is for different operations. There have been procedures in the past that address this same type of scenario where government agency discovers a vulnerability and either wants to use it or wants to, wants to keep it classified. There are procedures that have been in place for quite some time to do exactly the same thing as the VEP does. However, as we've seen with different disclosures, these vulnerabilities don't necessarily make it out to the vendor or the public, in a specified amount of time. The VEP does address some time frames as to when a vulnerability needs to be presented to the VEP and to all the VEP partners and members of the VEP. However, if a specific partner decides that no, this vulnerability should not be released, or that they have a question about it, there's no time frame that says within X amount of days or X amount of months that partner needs to actually come to a final decision.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was about to ask about historic precedents or other policies on the books, and it sounds like there are a number of different policies on the books. So, Willis, I wonder if you could leave us with best practices or advice for companies who may look at this policy and say, okay, this is great, but I need to have my own internal policy for identifying and disclosing data breaches. What best practices would you recommend?
Best practices I would recommend would be if you have discovered a vulnerability or you have a suspicion of a vulnerability, to actually get with the vendor that it affects, whether it be Microsoft, whether it be an AV company. Get with that vendor and follow their actual disclosure procedures before disclosing this to the public, or actually assessing your own environment as to how this vulnerability is going to affect you if it goes unpatched.